Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving into a really fascinating, dense, 20-page Supreme Court ruling to figure out exactly how a high-profile graft conviction gets overturned. We're unpacking the case of the Acostas versus the people of the Philippines. Now, this isn't about dramatic courtroom shouts. It's actually a masterclass in the precise definitions of fund types and the absolute heavy lifting required by the burden of proof. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the Acostas and the BVPC. Then, the initial Sandiganbayan conviction. Third, how the conflict charge was reversed. Fourth, the crucial difference between local funds and trust funds. And finally, the ultimate acquittal.
All right, let's jump right into part one, the Acostas and the BVPC.
At the absolute center of this entire legal saga is one specific transaction. Exactly 5.5 million pesos. Back in July 2002, this money was released to the Bukidnon Vegetable Producers Cooperative. We'll just call them BVPC for short. This release was facilitated by the municipality of Manolo Fortich, where the mayor at the time was Socorro Acosta. Now, you might be wondering, where exactly did this money come from? Well, it originated from the Priority Development Assistance Fund, or PDAF, belonging to Representative Nereus Acosta, who happens to be the mayor's son. If you follow this stuff, you know these are national discretionary funds earmarked for local projects. Representative Acosta essentially just chose BVPC to receive his PDAF allocation. To really grasp the scope of this, we have to look at the timeline. It's a massive arc. The cooperative was formed way back in 1998 with Mayor Socorro Acosta as a founding member. Fast forward to 2002, and those funds are released. But it takes 14 years until 2016 for a lower court conviction to happen, and then finally a Supreme Court acquittal in 2021. So we're literally looking at a legal journey spanning over 2 decades.
Okay, moving on to part two, the Sandiganbayan conviction.
The lower court, the Sandiganbayan, initially convicted Mayor Socorro Acosta under Section 3H of the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act. To get that conviction, they had to check off 3 specific legal boxes. 1, she was a public officer. 2, they argued she had a clear financial interest in BVPC because she helped found it. And 3, they claimed she intervened in her official capacity simply by signing the disbursement voucher to release the funds. But it didn't stop there. Both Mayor Acosta and her son, the representative, were also hit with a conviction under Section 3E of the exact same law. The lower court asserted the two acted with, and this is a quote, manifest partiality, evident bad faith, or gross inexcusable negligence. They argued this action caused undue injury to the government while handing out unwarranted benefits to a private party, which in this case was the cooperative. So what was this guilty verdict actually built on? It rested heavily on a few very specific assumptions. The lower court looked at the transaction and said, hey, there's no memorandum of agreement here. Plus, there was absolutely no approval from the local council. When you combine those missing procedural steps with the fact that the BVPC was originally organized by the mayor, her husband, and her sister, well, the lower court basically assumed this was a textbook case of corrupt family preference bypassing local government safeguards. Which brings us to part 3, reversing the conflict charge. This is where we hit a really dramatic legal pivot. Because if the Sandiganbayan looked at these facts and saw obvious graft, you have to ask, what crucial details did the Supreme Court seize so differently? It actually all comes down to a super strict interpretation of corporate law and the actual on-the-ground mechanics of how national funds are distributed. Here is something absolutely fascinating. The Supreme Court actually took the cooperative code and used it to dismantle the prosecution's narrative. You see, Article 28 of the code specifically outlaws elective government officials from serving as officers of a cooperative. So the moment Socorro Acosta became mayor in 2001, she was legally forced to divest her interest and step down as the chairperson of BVPs. And the paper trail totally backed this up. The 2001 annual report showed she was no longer an officer when those funds were dispersed in 2002. Since the prosecution completely failed to prove she had any remaining financial interest, that entire element of the crime just falls apart. Then the Supreme Court tackled that third element, the supposed intervention. They made a massive distinction here, ruling that merely signing a disbursement voucher for a pre-approved national fund does not by any means count as the actual intervention needed to break the law. The law is there to stop people from using their influence to force a transaction. But Mayor Acosta didn't choose the beneficiary. Her son did, using his allotted national funds. So her signature, it was essentially just a ministerial act, just standard required paperwork to release pre-allotted money, not a corrupt intervention.
Let's dive into part 4, which is arguably the most critical. Local funds versus trust funds.
Right here is the absolute core conflict of the entire case. The lower court treated this PDAF money exactly as if it were local municipal funds. Under the local government code, if a town gives its own money to an NGO, it absolutely needs a formal agreement and local council approval. But the Supreme Court pointed out a glaring flaw in that logic. This PDF allocation, it isn't local money, it's national money. To back this up, the Supreme Court pointed directly to Section 309 of the Local Government Code. Since the PDAF cash came straight from the national government, it entered the municipality's accounts strictly as a trust fund. The local government was literally just acting as a trustee, an agent holding money that was already earmarked for a specific purpose at the national level. Because of that status, it didn't need local legislative concurrence, and it didn't need a local memorandum of agreement. It is a completely different ballgame. And you know what? The documentary evidence completely supported us. The court highlighted that the disbursement was fully authorized by the Department of Budget and Management. It was covered by a very specific special allotment release order. But the real kicker? The physical disbursement voucher itself was literally stamped in bold letters with the words trust fund. By proving that all the proper national guidelines were actually followed, the Supreme Court demonstrated there was zero bad faith, no manifest partiality, and absolutely no gross, inexcusable negligence. Which leads us right into part 5, the final acquittal. To completely finalize the acquittal on that Section 3E charge, the court had to address the elephant in the room, the claim of undue injury to the government. Keep in mind, for a graft conviction to actually stick, you can't just assume injury. You have to prove it. And the record showed that the cooperative actually spent the 5.5 million pesos exactly as intended for its agricultural purposes, and they provided all the required liquidation documents. The prosecution unequivocally failed to prove any actual damage to the government or that the cooperative got some sort of unwarranted freebie. So it all boils down to a classic legal maxim the court cited from the case of People v. Sabunging. It goes, he who asserts, not he who denies, must prove. In our justice system, the burden of proof rests entirely on the prosecution's shoulders. Mayor Acosta didn't have to legally prove she wasn't an officer of the coup anymore. The prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she was, and, well, they simply couldn't. I'm going to leave you with this thought to mull over. It's really easy to look at a ruling like this from the outside and dismiss it as just a bunch of fancy legal loopholes. But how do strict legal technicalities, like accurately parsing corporate divestment rules and defining trust funds, ultimately protect the fundamental presumption of innocence in our justice system? This case really shows us that demanding extreme precision in the law isn't just boring bureaucracy. It is the exact mechanism that protects citizens from being convicted based on assumptions rather than hard, verifiable evidence. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the hard questions.